Jack always knew that living in a neighborhood governed by a homeowners association, HOA, was like willingly signing up for a lifetime subscription to petty bureaucracy. But he never imagined that one day, his prize-winning bull, Hercules, would become the latest casualty of HOA tyranny. And yet, here he was, standing over the lifeless body of Hercules, his beloved Angus bull, who had been gunned down by Karen from 3 doors down. Yes, that Karen, the HOA president who treated grass height regulations like they were constitutional amendments and whose idea of community harmony involved passive-aggressive notes on everyone's windshield. The scene was so absurd that Jack almost laughed. Almost. But the sight of Hercules sprawled out in the middle of his pasture, a bullet hole in his side, was enough to wipe the smirk off his face. Karen had claimed property damage as her justification for the shooting. A claim as flimsy as the plastic flamingos she insisted were art installations in her front yard. And what had Hercules done to deserve this fate? He had wandered into Karen's yard and trampled a couple of hydrangeas. Hydrangeas! Jack couldn't decide what was more ridiculous, Karen's overreaction or the fact that she owned a gun in the first place. But let's rewind for a moment. Jack wasn't just any farmer. He was a man who took pride in his work and his animals, especially Hercules. The bull wasn't just a pet or livestock. He was a local celebrity. Hercules had won first place at the county fair 3 years running, earning Jack not only bragging rights but also a hefty cash prize that kept his small farm afloat. People came from miles around to see Hercules, snapping photos and marveling at his glossy black coat and formidable horns. To Jack, Hercules represented everything good about rural life: hard work, community spirit, and the occasional triumph over adversity. Karen, on the other hand, represented everything wrong with suburban America. She was the kind of person who measured her self-worth by how many rules she could enforce on her neighbors. Her yard was immaculate, not a blade of grass out of place, but her soul was as barren as her driveway during HOA-mandated trash pickup hours. She had been gunning for Jack, figuratively speaking, ever since he moved into the neighborhood 5 years ago. She hated his farm, hated the smell of manure wafting through her open windows on summer evenings, and most of all, hated Hercules. Karen's vendetta against Hercules started small. Complaints about noise pollution, when Hercules bellowed too loudly during mating season. Accusations that his presence lowered property values. Threats to report Jack to animal control for harboring an aggressive animal. But Jack had always managed to deflect her nonsense with a mix of charm and legal savvy. Until now. The morning of the incident, Jack had been repairing a fence on the far side of his property when he heard the gunshot. He dropped his hammer and sprinted toward the sound, heart pounding in his chest. By the time he reached Karen's yard, it was too late. Hercules lay motionless on her perfectly manicured lawn while Karen stood nearby with a smoking rifle in her hands and an expression that could only be described as smug satisfaction. "He destroyed my hydrangeas," she said matter-of-factly, as if that explained everything. Jack stared at her in disbelief. "You shot my bull over flowers? They're not just flowers," Karen snapped. "They're part of my landscaping plan." Jack wanted to scream, but he knew better than to lose his temper in front of Karen, or anyone else from the HOA who might be watching from behind their curtains. Instead, he took a deep breath and said, "You do realize this is illegal, right?" Karen rolled her eyes. "Oh, please. I'm within my rights as a homeowner to protect my property. Not when it involves killing someone else's livestock," Jack countered. Karen smirked. "We'll see about that." And with that, she turned on her heel and marched back into her house, leaving Jack alone with Hercules and an overwhelming sense of rage. But Jack wasn't just angry. He was determined. He knew Karen had crossed a line, not just morally but legally, and he intended to make her pay for it. Over the next few days, Jack threw himself into research mode, poring over state laws regarding livestock protection and HOA regulations about firearm use within residential neighborhoods. What he discovered was both infuriating and empowering. Karen had violated multiple statutes by shooting Hercules without cause or warning. For starters, Texas law, where Jack's neighborhood was located, explicitly stated that livestock owners were entitled to compensation if their animals were harmed due to negligence or malice. Additionally, HOA bylaws prohibited residents from discharging firearms within community limits unless it was an emergency, and hydrangea damage hardly qualified as such. Armed with this information and a newfound appreciation for legal loopholes, Jack began building his case against Karen and against the HOA itself for enabling her behavior. He filed police reports, gathered witness statements from neighbors who had seen Karen brandishing her rifle earlier that morning, and even hired an attorney specializing in agricultural law to help him navigate the complexities of civil litigation. Meanwhile, Karen continued to act as if she were untouchable, posting passive-aggressive updates on the HOA message board about the importance of protecting our community from unruly elements, and hosting garden parties where she showed off her newly replanted hydrangeas like trophies from some twisted war. But Jack wasn't about to let her get away with it, not after what she'd done to Hercules. As far as he was concerned, this wasn't just about justice. It was about sending a message. You don't mess with farmers or their animals without consequences. And so began what would later be known as the Battle of Bull Gate, a legal showdown between Jack and Karen that would shake their sleepy suburban neighborhood to its core. Jack didn't waste any time after Hercules' untimely demise. While Karen was busy sipping iced tea on her porch, basking in the glory of her hydrangea revenge, Jack was plotting. He wasn't just angry. He was a man on a mission, fueled by righteous indignation and a deep-seated hatred for HOA overreach. If Karen thought she could shoot his prize bull and walk away with nothing but a smug grin and a new landscaping plan, she was about to learn that Jack wasn't the kind of guy who let things slide. No, Jack was the kind of guy who read HOA bylaws for fun, and now those bylaws were about to become his weapon of choice. The first thing Jack did was call the local sheriff's office to report the incident. The deputy who answered sounded bored, probably imagining this was just another neighborly spat over lawn care. But Jack quickly set him straight. "She shot my bull," Jack said, his voice tight with barely contained fury. "My prize-winning bull." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "She shot your bull?" The deputy sounded like he couldn't decide whether to laugh or take Jack seriously. "Yes," Jack said firmly, "and I want to press charges." The deputy sighed, clearly regretting his career choices. "All right, sir. I'll send someone over to take your statement." When the officer arrived at Jack's farm later that afternoon, he took one look at Hercules' massive carcass and let out a low whistle. "That's one big bull," he muttered. "He was one big bull," Jack corrected him. "Now he's evidence." The officer nodded solemnly and began jotting down notes while Jack recounted the events of that morning in painstaking detail. When Jack mentioned Karen's claim about protecting her property, the officer raised an eyebrow. "Hydrangeas?" he asked incredulously. "Hydrangeas," Jack confirmed. The officer shook his head and muttered something under his breath about crazy HOA people, before promising to file a report and follow up with Karen. But Jack knew better than to rely solely on law enforcement, especially in a town where HOA politics were practically a second government. If he wanted justice for Hercules, he'd have to take matters into his own hands. And so began Jack's deep dive into the murky world of HOA regulations and livestock protection laws. Jack started by reviewing every HOA document he could get his hands on, the bylaws, the rules and regulations, even meeting minutes from years past. He quickly discovered that Karen had been bending the rules to suit her own agenda for years. There were complaints about her enforcing arbitrary fines for things like unauthorized garden gnomes and excessively cheerful holiday decorations. One neighbor had even been penalized for having a mailbox that Karen deemed too whimsical. It was clear that Karen saw herself not just as HOA president but as some sort of suburban dictator, and Jack intended to dethrone her. Next, Jack turned his attention to state laws regarding livestock protection. He learned that Texas law explicitly stated that livestock owners were entitled to compensation if their animals were harmed due to negligence or malice, and shooting a bull over hydrangeas definitely fell into the malice category. He also discovered that HOA bylaws prohibited residents from discharging firearms within community limits unless it was an emergency, and unless those hydrangeas were secretly harboring terrorists, Karen had no excuse. Armed with this information, Jack began building his case against Karen, and against the HOA itself for enabling her behavior. He started by gathering evidence. Photos of Hercules before and after the incident, footage from his security cameras showing Karen marching into her yard with a rifle, and witness statements from neighbors who had seen her yelling at Hercules moments before pulling the trigger. One neighbor, an elderly woman named Doris who had lived in the neighborhood since before it became an HOA nightmare, was particularly eager to help. "Karen's been a thorn in everyone's side for years," Doris said as she sipped her tea on Jack's porch. "She fined me $50 last Christmas because my wreath clashed with her color scheme." Jack nodded sympathetically. "Well, she's finally gone too far." Doris leaned forward conspiratorially. "You know what you should do? Sue her pants off." "That's the plan," Jack said with a grin. But suing Karen wasn't enough. Jack wanted to make sure she felt the full weight of her actions. So he decided to take things one step further. He filed a formal complaint against the HOA itself for failing to enforce its own rules regarding firearm use and animal welfare. If Karen thought she could hide behind her title as HOA president, she was about to learn that even dictators have their limits. When Karen received notice of the lawsuit a few days later, she stormed over to Jack's farm in a rage. "You can't be serious," she shouted as she marched up his driveway. "Oh, I'm very serious," Jack replied calmly. Karen waved the papers in his face. "This is ridiculous. You're suing me over flowers." "No," Jack said evenly. "I'm suing you over murder." Karen scoffed. "It was just a bull." Jack stepped closer, his eyes blazing with fury. "It wasn't just anything, it was Hercules. And you killed him." Karen opened her mouth to argue but quickly realized she had no defense. Not legally, anyway. So she turned on her heel and stomped back to her house, muttering under her breath about ungrateful neighbors and overgrown farms. As word spread throughout the neighborhood about the lawsuit, residents began rallying behind Jack. Not because they cared about Hercules, though many did, but because they saw an opportunity to finally take down Karen and her iron-fisted rule over their lives. People started sharing their own horror stories about Karen. Fines for mismatched patio furniture, threats over unapproved bird feeders, even accusations of trespassing when kids accidentally kicked soccer balls into her yard. By the time Jack's attorney filed additional claims against both Karen and the HOA for negligence and harassment, it was clear that this wasn't just about Hercules anymore. It was about justice for everyone who had ever suffered under Karen's reign of terror. And while Jack knew there was still a long road ahead before he could truly avenge Hercules' death, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction knowing that Karen's days as HOA president were numbered, and that soon enough, she'd learn what happens when you mess with farmers or their bulls. Jack knew that the road to justice wasn't going to be a smooth one. After all, he was up against Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA, and her army of passive-aggressive rules. But Jack wasn't just fighting for Hercules. He was fighting for every neighbor who had ever been fined for having a mailbox that was too whimsical or a garden gnome deemed unacceptable. This wasn't just a lawsuit, it was a revolution. And revolutions, Jack reminded himself, are rarely peaceful. The first shot in this legal war came when Karen filed a counterclaim against Jack. Yes, you heard that right. Karen, who had shot Hercules in cold blood, was now claiming that she was the victim. Her argument, emotional distress caused by Hercules' rampage through her hydrangeas. She even included photos of her mangled flower bed as evidence, complete with captions like, "Before the bull," and "After the bull." It was so ridiculous that Jack's lawyer, a sharp-tongued woman named Linda, actually laughed out loud when she saw it. "She really thinks this is going to hold up in court?" Linda said, shaking her head in disbelief. Jack shrugged. "Karen thinks hydrangeas are more important than living beings. I wouldn't put anything past her." Linda smirked. "Well, lucky for us, the law doesn't care about hydrangeas." The next few weeks were a whirlwind of legal drama. Karen hired an attorney who looked like he'd stepped straight out of a daytime soap opera. Slick hair, gleaming white teeth, and an attitude that screamed, "I charge by the hour." He spent most of his time trying to paint Karen as a misunderstood victim, a woman who had simply been defending her property from an unpredictable and dangerous animal. Jack couldn't decide what was more insulting: The fact that Karen thought anyone would believe Hercules was dangerous, or the fact that she kept referring to him as the Beast. Linda, however, wasn't fazed. She came to every hearing armed with facts, figures, and enough sarcasm to make even the judge crack a smile. When Karen's attorney tried to argue that Hercules had caused thousands of dollars in damage to her landscaping, Linda pulled out receipts showing that hydrangeas cost about $30 per plant. "So let me get this straight," Linda said, her tone dripping with mockery. "You're claiming emotional distress over $90 worth of flowers?" Karen's attorney sputtered something about principle, but it was clear he was losing ground. Meanwhile, Jack had become something of a local hero. Neighbors who had once grumbled about the smell of manure wafting from his farm were now cheering him on like he was some sort of folk legend. Doris from down the street started baking pies for him every week, for strength, she said. And even the guy who always complained about Jack's tractor blocking traffic stopped by to offer his support. "You're doing God's work," he said solemnly as he handed Jack a six-pack of beer. Jack accepted it with a grin. Well, someone's got to stand up to Karen. But not everyone in the neighborhood was on Jack's side. Karen still had her loyal followers, mostly people who were too afraid to cross her or too invested in HOA politics to admit she might be wrong. These were the folks who whispered behind closed doors about how Jack was making a scene and how Hercules had been out of control. One particularly vocal supporter even started circulating flyers claiming that Jack's farm was a public nuisance and should be shut down entirely. Jack didn't let it bother him. He knew that revolutions weren't won by playing nice, and besides, he had bigger things to worry about. Like the fact that Karen had somehow convinced the HOA board to hold an emergency meeting about his farm's impact on community standards. The meeting took place in Karen's living room, a space so pristine it looked like it belonged in a museum rather than an actual house. Jack arrived armed with documents proving his farm was fully compliant with zoning laws and HOA regulations. But he quickly realized this wasn't going to be a fair fight. Karen opened the meeting with a dramatic speech about how she had been traumatized by Hercules' rampage and how Jack's farm was ruining the neighborhood's aesthetic appeal. She even brought out a chart showing property values over the past 5 years, though Linda later pointed out that most of her data came from Zillow listings in completely different towns. When it was finally Jack's turn to speak, he kept his cool barely. "I understand that some people might not like my farm," he said evenly. "But let's be clear. My farm has been here longer than this HOA has existed, and I've followed every rule you've thrown at me, even the ones that don't make any sense." Karen sniffed indignantly but didn't interrupt. "And as for Hercules," Jack continued, his voice growing sharper, "he wasn't just livestock, he was family. He didn't deserve what happened to him." There was an awkward silence as several board members avoided eye contact with Jack. Even Karen looked slightly uncomfortable, though she quickly recovered and launched into another tirade about community standards. By the end of the meeting, it was clear that no one wanted to take sides publicly. Not yet anyway, but Jack could tell he'd struck a nerve. The tide was turning. People were starting to see Karen for what she really was, a bully hiding behind bylaws. As the legal battle dragged on, Jack found himself growing more determined and more creative. He started hosting weekly barbecues at his farm, featuring burgers made from Hercules' less fortunate cousins, and inviting anyone who wanted to hear his side of the story. The events quickly became neighborhood gatherings where people swapped stories about Karen's antics and brainstormed ways to hold her accountable. One particularly memorable barbecue ended with Doris leading everyone in an impromptu chant. "Down with Karen! Justice for Hercules!" It wasn't exactly subtle, but then again, neither was Karen shooting a bull over flowers. By the time the court date rolled around, Jack felt ready for whatever Karen threw at him, even if it meant sitting through another one of her melodramatic speeches about hydrangeas. Because no matter how long it took or how many hoops he had to jump through, Jack knew one thing for sure. Justice might be slow, but revenge is worth every second. The day of the trial arrived, and Jack walked into the courthouse with the kind of confidence only a man who spent weeks meticulously preparing can muster. He wasn't just armed with facts, evidence, and a lawyer who could verbally dismantle Karen's arguments like a kid tearing apart a Lego set. He was armed with righteous fury. Karen might have her fancy attorney and her hydrangea propaganda, but Jack had something far more powerful: the truth and a deep-seated desire to see her squirm. Karen, of course, showed up looking like she was auditioning for a role in a courtroom drama. She wore a tailored suit that screamed, "I'm better than you," and carried a binder so thick it could double as a weapon. Her lawyer was right behind her, flashing his pearly whites and exuding an aura of smugness that made Jack want to roll his eyes into the next dimension. Jack's lawyer, Linda, was unimpressed. "Let me guess," she whispered as they took their seats. "He's going to start with some nonsense about community values and emotional distress." Jack smirked. "That's exactly what he'll do." And sure enough, when Karen's lawyer stood up to deliver his opening statement, he launched into a speech so melodramatic it could have been written by Shakespeare himself. He painted Karen as a victim, a brave homeowner who had been forced to defend her property from an unpredictable and dangerous animal. He even threw in a few lines about how Hercules' actions had caused Karen irreparable harm and a loss of peace in her own home. Linda leaned over to Jack and muttered, "If this guy starts crying, I'm walking out." Jack stifled a laugh but kept his focus on the judge, who looked like she was already regretting her decision to preside over this case. When it was Linda's turn to speak, she didn't waste any time cutting through the theatrics. "Your Honor," she began, her tone sharp and authoritative. "This case isn't about hydrangeas or emotional distress. It's about accountability. The defendant shot my client's prize-winning bull, a living creature, over flowers. And not only is that morally reprehensible, it's also illegal." Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat but didn't say anything. Linda continued, presenting evidence with the precision of a surgeon wielding a scalpel. She showed photos of Hercules before and after the incident, security footage of Karen marching into her yard with a rifle, and witness statements from neighbors who had seen her yelling at Hercules moments before pulling the trigger. One particularly damning piece of evidence was the HOA bylaws themselves, which explicitly prohibited residents from discharging firearms within community limits unless there was an immediate threat to life or safety. Linda read the clause aloud for everyone to hear, then turned to Karen's lawyer with an expression that said, "Your move." Karen's lawyer tried to argue that Hercules was a threat, that his size alone made him dangerous, but Linda wasn't having it. She pulled out photos of Hercules at the county fair, surrounded by children petting him and posing for pictures. "Does this look like an aggressive animal to you?" Linda asked, holding up one photo where Hercules was wearing a flower crown that someone had placed on his head. Karen's lawyer sputtered something about unpredictable behavior, but it was clear he was grasping at straws. The turning point came when Linda called Jack to the stand. He spoke passionately about Hercules, not just as livestock but as family. He described how much effort he'd put into raising him, how proud he'd been when Hercules won those county fair prizes, and how devastated he'd felt when Karen took that away from him. "She didn't just kill my bull," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "She killed part of my livelihood, and part of my heart." Even the judge looked moved by Jack's testimony. Karen's lawyer tried to cross-examine Jack by bringing up irrelevant details, like whether his farm smelled bad or whether he'd ever received complaints from neighbors, but Linda objected every time, and the judge sustained every objection. By the time Karen herself took the stand, it was clear she was on shaky ground. She tried to portray herself as a victim, someone who had been forced into action by circumstances beyond her control, but her story didn't hold up under scrutiny. When Linda asked why she hadn't simply called animal control or contacted Jack instead of resorting to violence, Karen stammered something about acting in the heat of the moment. "And yet," Linda said coolly, "you had time to retrieve your rifle from inside your house before shooting Hercules." Karen flushed red but didn't respond. The final nail in Karen's coffin came when Linda presented financial records showing that Hercules wasn't just any bull. He was worth thousands of dollars due to his breeding potential and prize-winning status. The judge visibly raised an eyebrow at this revelation. Suddenly, Karen's claims about hydrangeas seemed even more absurd. When both sides finished presenting their cases, the judge took some time to deliberate before delivering her verdict. She ruled in favor of Jack, Not just because Karen had violated state laws and HOA regulations, but because her actions were clearly malicious and unjustified. Karen was ordered to pay substantial damages, not only for Hercules' value but also for emotional distress and legal fees. The HOA itself wasn't off the hook either. They were reprimanded for failing to enforce their own rules and ordered to revise their policies to prevent future incidents like this one. As the judge read out her decision, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of relief and satisfaction. Justice had been served. Karen looked like she'd swallowed a lemon. Her lawyer quickly packed up his things and left without saying goodbye. Outside the courthouse, Jack was greeted by cheers from neighbors who had come to support him. Doris handed him another pie. "Victory pie?" she explained, while others clapped him on the back and congratulated him for standing up to Karen. Jack smiled as he looked around at his friends and supporters, the people who had rallied behind him not just for Hercules, but for what he represented: fairness, community spirit, and standing up against injustice. And while nothing could bring Hercules back, Jack knew one thing for sure: his legacy would live on, not just in memory but in every neighbor who dared to defy HOA tyranny in his name. Jack didn't just win the lawsuit, he won the war. Karen's defeat wasn't just a legal loss. It was a public humiliation of epic proportions, the kind that would be whispered about at HOA meetings for years to come. The neighborhood had collectively turned on her, and her reign as HOA president crumbled faster than her hydrangeas under Hercules' mighty hooves. Jack, meanwhile, was basking in the glow of his victory, sipping lemonade on his porch like a man who had just slayed a suburban dragon. But Jack wasn't content to simply enjoy his win. No, he wanted to make sure Karen and the HOA never forgot what happened when they messed with him or his animals. His first order of business? A new sign at the entrance to his farm. It was big, bold, and impossible to miss, with bright red letters that read, "Welcome to Titan's Farm, home of the bull that won't back down." Beneath it was a smaller sign that read, "HOA rules stop here." Titan was Hercules' successor, a massive bull with an attitude as big as his horns. Jack had used part of Karen's court-ordered payment to buy him from a breeder upstate, and he made sure everyone knew Titan was here to stay. The neighborhood kids loved him. They'd come by after school to feed him apples and take selfies with him. Karen, on the other hand, couldn't even look at Titan without turning redder than her prized begonias. But Jack didn't stop at the sign. He decided it was time to give back to the community that had supported him through the trial. And what better way to do that than by hosting a neighborhood barbecue? He called it Justice Fest, and it was everything Karen hated. Loud, crowded, and unapologetically fun. There were burgers, made from Hercules' less fortunate relatives, live music, and even a raffle where the grand prize was a year's supply of manure for anyone brave enough to use it as fertilizer. Doris brought her famous pies, which she'd renamed Hercules Memorial Pies, in honor of Jack's late bull. The guy who used to complain about Jack's tractor blocking traffic showed up with a cooler full of beer and declared himself Team Titan for life. Even people from neighboring communities came by to join the festivities, eager to hear the story of how Jack had taken down Karen and the HOA. Karen herself stayed locked inside her house during Justice Fest, peeking out from behind her curtains like a villain in hiding. Jack made sure to wave at her every time he passed by her yard, just to remind her that she wasn't invited. But while Justice Fest was a hit, Jack knew the real victory lay in what came next: reforming the HOA. With Karen dethroned as president, the board was forced to hold new elections. And guess who got nominated? That's right, Jack. At first, he laughed off the idea. He didn't want anything to do with HOA politics. But when Doris pointed out that this was his chance to make real changes, and maybe even prevent another Karen from rising to power, Jack reluctantly agreed. His campaign slogan, "No Bull," it was perfect, not only because it referenced Hercules and Titan, but also because it summed up Jack's approach to leadership: straightforward, honest, and completely devoid of Karen-style nonsense. Jack won by a landslide. His first act as HOA president was abolishing all fines for aesthetic violations, much to Karen's dismay. His second act was implementing a new rule. Any complaints about livestock had to be submitted in writing and reviewed by an independent committee before action could be taken. And his third act? hosting monthly community meetings where neighbors could voice their concerns without fear of retaliation. A radical concept in a neighborhood that had been ruled by Karen's iron fist for so long. Under Jack's leadership, the neighborhood began to change. People started planting whimsical gardens without worrying about fines for mismatched flowers. Kids played soccer in their yards without fear of being reported for unauthorized noise. Even the guy with the flamingo lawn ornaments felt emboldened enough to add a few more birds to his collection. Karen tried to fight back. She filed complaints about everything from Titans bellowing to Jack's new mailbox, which featured a bull-shaped flag. But no one took her seriously anymore. She'd become a running joke in the neighborhood, her name synonymous with petty tyranny. One day, Jack found an anonymous note in his mailbox that read, "Thank you for standing up to Karen. You've made this neighborhood livable again." He smiled as he folded it up and tucked it into his pocket. A reminder that sometimes, even small victories can make a big difference. As for Titan, he thrived under Jack's care, becoming even more popular than Hercules had been. Jack built him a custom pen with reinforced fencing, just in case, and started training him for next year's county fair. Titan had big shoes or hooves to fill, but Jack knew he'd do Hercules proud. And so life went on in the neighborhood, better than ever before. Jack continued farming, hosting barbecues, and leading the HOA with his signature mix of humor and common sense. Karen continued glaring at him from behind her curtains but never dared confront him again. In the end, justice wasn't just about winning a lawsuit or dethroning Karen. It was about creating a community where people could live freely without fear of arbitrary rules or petty dictatorships. And thanks to Jack and Hercules, that dream had finally become reality. If you enjoyed this story of suburban rebellion and bovine justice, don't forget to share, comment below with your thoughts, or maybe your own HOA horror stories, and subscribe for more tales of triumph over tyranny. Because remember,